Hey everyone, Tactics here with a 10.2 update to my Guardian Druid guide. In this video, I'll be covering all the changes the spec is getting going into Season 3 of Dragonflight, how their new tier bonus is looking, kind of how it plays as well, my recommended talent builds for both Raid and Mythic Plus alongside some potential variations, rotation and defensive usage tips, and gearing stuff including the best embellishments, trinkets, weapons, consumables, you name it. In addition, I'll be pushing a significant update to my written Druid guide over on the Method website. So if you prefer that kind of medium where you can just, open up, look at it, it's a visual, it's right there on the screen, I'll link that down in the description below, and that will be consistently updated as changes happen over the course of this patch. So I can't update this video if a hotfix happens buffing the spec. I can update that written guide, so make sure you check it out if any buffs or nerfs come in. To start things off, I did want to kind of talk about what's going on with Guardian Druids in patch 10.2, which honestly is not a ton. We've got a ton of cool new Druid forms, which is great to see, but outside of that, there's really only a couple of significant changes to mention, the first of which is an adjustment to the Blood Frenzy talent. This is now capped at 5 targets instead of being uncapped. However, in turn, the additional rage generated has been upped to 3 from 2, meaning this is actually going to generate more rage at 7 or fewer targets, but less rage at 8 or more. Kind of the goal here is to rein in the uncapped rage generation of Guardian Druids in massive pulls, and I think this trade-off is kind of fair because it did get a bit crazy as you got into the 12 plus target scenarios, but Guardian Druids at lower target counts did actually struggle a bit with rage generation in my opinion, so this is a bit of a happy medium, hopefully, assuming it actually worked correctly, but I'll get into that later. On top of this, Mangle also received a boost to its baseline rage generation, moving up to 12 from 10. The other interesting change is actually an undocumented one, which I'm not sure if is a bug or not, but hey, we're going to run with it, and that is Galactic Guardian and Twin Moonfire now have a similar interaction that they've had in the past, not exactly the same, but quite similar. Basically, the additional second Moonfire that is casted when you get a Galactic Guardian proc and you're spec'd in Twin Moonfire, so that second Moonfire, this will actually consume the existing Galactic Guardian proc you had, causing it to deal the extra damage and generate that rage. Similar again, but not 100% how it used to function back in 10.0 when Galactic Guardian procs would do that to themselves. Now it only works with Twin Moonfire, and because it only works with Twin Moonfire, it only works if you have 2 or more targets. So it does not work in single targets, and essentially this means in AoE situations, you get a bit of a rage bump and damage bump from speccing into these 2 talents, and you're going to see that's basically the only change to the Mythic Plus build is that we've dropped Flashing Claws, which we ran all of 10.1.5 through to 10.2, and we've actually picked up Galactic Guardian and Twin Moonfires because of this interaction. Now again, I don't know if this is a bug or not, but we're going to use it for now and see what happens. Check out that method guide if anything changes. Moving on, let's talk tier bonuses, where Guardian is losing their exceptionally powerful Aberrus tier set for one that's still decent in Mythic Plus, but potentially a bit lacking in certain rage situations. So, the 2-piece here, rage you spend during Rage of the Sleeper fuels the growth of Dream Thorns, which wreathe you in protection after Rage of the Sleeper expires, absorbing 25% of the damage dealt to you while the thorns remain, or for 45 seconds. Is also capped at your max HP, scaled with versatility and such. So basically this kind of functions like Ignore Pain for warriors, but 25% of the damage is absorbed into this instead of whatever the Ignore Pain value is. Moving on to the 4-piece, each 40 rage you spend while Rage of the Sleeper is active extends its duration by 1 second up to 5 seconds here, so max value at 200 rage spent. Your Dream Thorns also become Blazing Thorns, causing 100% of the damage absorbed to be reflected back at the attacker. Notably, there are 2 common kind of mistakes made with this tier set in terms of how they work that I want to clear up. The first is that the actual absorb effect itself does now have priority over Ursoc's Fury if you're spec'd into that. So this tier set will always be consumed before Ursoc's Fury. It has the #1 priority. Didn't initially in PTR, but it does now, so don't worry about that. The second is environmental damage. It does actually deal the thorns, the Blazing Thorns damage, to whatever mob you're targeting if you take environmental damage. So keep that in mind. If you step in a puddle or whatever, it's not necessarily you losing value from the shield. And also technically you can do weird things like pull mobs very far away with this. So keep that in mind. maybe a good thing you want to do, maybe something you do by accident. You're like, oh no, I pulled an entire pack. So keep that in mind. In general, though, both offensively and defensively, this is looking like a bit of a downgrade from the 10.1 tier set. But as I mentioned, that gap is going to be smaller in Mythic Plus than in Raid for two main reasons. First, you have access to additional rage generation in AoE thanks to Blood Frenzy and that Galactic Guardian Twin Moonfire combo I talked about, and this lets you pump out more spenders during the duration of Rage of the Sleeper, allowing you to build a bigger shield up and as well as maximize that CDR pretty much every time. Second, you are the only tank in a dungeon scenario, right? Where you're going to be constantly taking damage, whereas in a raid, that's not necessarily the case, and there's potentially situations where you aren't able to get the full value of the tier set because the shield just kind of expires and nothing happens at that point. In terms of gameplay changes, this set does incentivize you to pool your rage up to at least 80, but as high as you can get it before you're actually using Rage of the Sleeper, just so you can, again, maximize both the shield you're gaining from the 2-piece as well as the extension from the 4-piece. There is also a bit of counter synergy here with the Guardian kit, as talents like Tooth and Claw and Berserk Persistence reduce the rage cost of certain abilities, and this causes their contribution to be nothing if it's Tooth and Claw, or reduced if it's Berserk Persistence, things like that, right? So that can feel kind of bad. On top of that, it can encourage some weird gameplay in lower target count situations. Basically, again, if the shield ever expires after that 45-second duration, you've just lost potential damage from the tier set, and this doesn't usually happen in Mythic Plus scenarios, like I was saying, because you're the only tank, and you're tanking multiple mobs, etc., etc. But during boss fights in Raid, it's 100% possible that you aren't going to take enough damage to actually break your shield in time, and the workaround for this is to just kind of take as much damage as possible, right? Whether that's not using Iron Fur while the shield is up, whether that's, standing in environmental damage to hit your target, things like that definitely feel a bit weird, but again, something to keep in mind if you're trying to min-max the damage you're getting from this tier bonus. With that weirdness of the tier set in mind, I do think there are two adjustments I would like to see that would kind of get rid of these. First, allowing discounted mauls, raises, or iron furs to work as if they consumed their standard rage amount. Pretty straightforward here, just to make these feel good to press when combined with a tier set and that talented effect, instead of just kind of feeling bittersweet. The second is to have the effect explode on expiration instead of just fizzle into nothingness. This would make it so you don't actually care if you consumed the entire effect or not, as you're always going to get as much damage value as you worked to create. Small changes, but I think they would make this bonus just feel a lot better to play in both Raid and Mythic Plus. Feedback aside here, let's hop into some talent builds, starting with Raid. Just a note here, I'll be kind of showing my recommended talent build on the screen here. I'll link it down in the description below as well if you want to import it. And I'll be talking through kind of potential variations to these builds depending on different situations, so keep that in mind. Starting with the general tree here, the choice nodes for Raid are pretty particular to the fight. For a lot of times, it doesn't matter at all whether you're running Incap or Mighty Bash, whether you're running Ursouls or Mass Entanglement, but very nichely on certain fights, it does matter, so keep that in mind. Same deal here, Wild Charge is kind of the default, but Tiger Dash has been extremely powerful on certain fights in the past, like Jailer or Painsmith. Nothing so far this expansion, but potential there if you ever have to travel long distances while not taking anything. So something to note, if you ever do want to pick up any of these other kind of niche talents, potentially like your Kick, a Typhoon CC, like a Hibernate or a Cyclone CC, you have a few options in what you would drop. My recommendations would either be Verdant Heart, as this only really affects external healing, not your own. Also, potentially, if you don't need Wild Charge, you could drop that. But more than likely, I think the other two solid drop options are Heart of the Wild and Nature's Vigil, as these are generally pretty low value coming from a Guardian Druid. Doesn't do a ton of healing here, doesn't really provide a ton of damage. You could also, if you don't need Roar every minute or less than 2 minutes, I guess, you could drop in Proof, Stampeding Roar. But in general, I actually tend to value this more than these other talents, assuming you're actually getting use out of this talent. But those are kind of what you could drop if you wanted some of these niche CC options. Moving over to the spec tree, moving down this list here, a note on Innate Resolve again. Currently, as of the recording this video, is bugged. It doesn't do anything. However, in general, I'm going to assume this bug gets fixed and it's going to be in the default talent. However, if you are running currently and it's not fixed, just put this point in Nurse Endurance. Otherwise, though, again, assuming it's fixed, that's going to be in Innate Resolve. You're moving down the tree here, and you have a couple options here. So I am going to go more arcane based towards the bottom, so I do pick up Fury of Nature. This point is pretty flexible here. You can move it back and forth between After the Wildfire and Thorns of Iron, so keep that in mind. It can go in either or, just kind of depending on if you want a little bit more damage or a little bit more group healing and self-healing. Just the one thing to note is this does get significantly less value in lower target count scenarios, so just because you're not going to be able to generate and spend rage super fast compared to in a Mythic Plus scenario. So something to keep in mind there. But then the big things here, of course, you got to get Rage of the Sleeper. We are still taking our Flashing Claws to synergize with Rend and Tear, so you get 5 stacks of Thrash, leading to 10% damage done in DR. Pretty nice there. And we're going down to single target Moonfire stuff. Moonless Knight pumps in single target. Really good. We only get Galactic Guardian here because, again, we're assuming lower target counts. Twin Moonfire is not really going to give us value at all, so we're not going to be grabbing that. Some potential variations, though, again, if you are starting to get into higher target counts, that's when you start to say, okay, maybe I'm dropping Flashing Claws again. Maybe I'm moving a bit more towards that kind of Mythic Plus-centric build where, you know, I'm going to want Blood Frenzy for Rage Generation, and maybe I want Twin Moonfire also for Rage Generation. Maybe if hitting the ads is important, killing the ads in AoE is important, you could potentially grab Raise, though I don't think you're going to do that in many, if any, situations. So something you can do, but not necessarily will do on the capstone front for Guardian. All right, next up, let's talk the Mythic Plus build here. So again, back to the general tree. Main changes is we are going to basically always be taking our Kick, and we're always going to be taking Typhoon, because again, those two generally valuable across all Mythic Plus dungeons. What we're dropping to get that is Heart of the Wild and Nature's Vigil, because like I said, these are not terribly valuable for Guardian Druid. I think the more valuable one in AoE specifically, especially with the Moonfire stuff, is Nature's Vigil. So you could do something like drop Verdant Heart to get Nature's Vigil, or you could drop a point or two in Nurturing Instinct if you want to do that to grab these things. But because Moonfire is going to be a bit more of our damage in Mythic Plus now, it is kind of more beneficial to have Nurturing Instinct, so that is an option. Also, if you want move speed, you can also move these talents over here and actually grab Feline Swiftness, which is kind of nice sometimes. Something to keep in mind as an option, not necessarily something you're always going to do. Moving over to the actual spec tree here, same deal with Innate Resolve. You can drop this point, you can put it in Dream of Cenarius, you can put it in Ursock's Endurance, just something you have a little bit flexible while it's bugged currently. Moving down the tree here, you'll notice a couple differences from the 10-1-5 Mythic Plus build. One, we've put points into Fury of Nature again. Again, this is because we're taking Moonfire talents now, a couple of them anyways. This is actually quite beneficial in terms of overall damage output. If you want to kind of have more other utility or whatever, you can drop this back down into the initial area, get Dream of Cenarius, get Ursock's Endurance for a nice little defensive and potentially personal healing or off healing niche. I'm going to, again, recommend this because it is 20% arcane damage, which is a fair number here. But that is an option here if you want to be maybe a bit more defensive. Moving into that capstone area, like I said, the only change here is we've picked up Galactic Guardian and Twin Moonfire from 10-1-5, and we've dropped Flashing Claws, and that is entirely because of how this interaction works. If this interaction, which I described earlier, is actually a bug, you'll likely go right back to Flashing Claws, which means, again, you'll drop this Fury of Nature and go, like, probably Thorns of Iron, Dream of Cenarius, that kind of thing, if this is a bug. If this remains functioning as it currently does, where the Twin Moonfire casted from a Galactic Guardian proc consumes the previous Galactic Guardian proc, then you're going to be running this for the rage generation and damage, and that's why you're also running Fury of Nature, so just something to keep in mind there. Now that we've talked about talent builds, let's talk Guardian Druid rotation. Starting out with single target situations, always be sure to maintain your Moonfire dot, as well as your Thrash stacks, either 3, 4, or 5, depending on how many points you're actually investing into Flashing Claws. Outside of that, you want to spend your Tooth and Claw procs on Maul for both damage and the DR it provides, followed by using unbuffed Mauls to make sure that you don't cap on Rage. Capping on Rage is one of the biggest cardinal sins. You want to avoid this at all costs as a Guardian Druid, so try your best to not ever cap, because again, it kind of has this kind of cascading effect because of other talents like After the Wildfire, like Ursock's Guidance, which lose value as you waste Rage, right? These are all kind of like the churning machine here. You spend Rage, and this kind of has these effects from these talents to, you know, CDR things, give healing, etc. And so by wasting Rage, you're reducing the value of all these other things as well. From there, it's pretty straightforward. Just keep your generators in Mangle, Thrash, and Galactic Guardian Moonfires on cooldown, so you have a steady flow of rage just coming in. And then if you have absolutely nothing else to do, you can press Swipe, though this should be quite infrequent. One of the biggest mistakes I see newer Guardian Druid players make is pressing Swipe just way too often because it's always available to press. This ability does very little damage, it generates you no rage whatsoever, so if you have literally any other button you could potentially press, you will probably want to do that instead. Looking at AoE, you similarly want to maintain your dots. Just note that above for targets, it isn't actually worth manually maintaining your Moonfires outside of just pressing your Galactic Guardian when you have nothing else to do, as you do tend to get a decent uptime kind of passively from that Galactic Guardian Twin Moonfire interaction. So these will passively kind of spread your Moonfires throughout packs, particularly at larger target counts. You also are going to shift to use Raise instead of Maul for both Tooth and Claw procs and to dump Rage, though note you can swap back to using Maul instead if you want priority target damage on like a totem or something, or an individual lieutenant mob in lower target counts. Just keep in mind that this is also going to result in less shielding from Ursoc's Fury. Otherwise, once again, just keep your rage generators on cooldown and fill with Swipe, though note that the Vicious Cycle talent while you're in Incarnation can slightly change the generator that you prioritize using. This is a bit more min-maxy, so I'm not going to dive into it in this video, but the method guide has the full breakdown of how this works, so check that out again, linked in the description. That is rotational stuff, but as a tank, surviving is pretty important, and well, doing your rotation correctly is a large part of that. The other part is kind of how well you use and layer your defensive cooldowns and abilities, so let's talk about what cooldowns Guardians have and how I recommend you use them. The big one is, of course, Incarnation. Lasts 30 seconds, gives you a ton of HP, and depending on your talents, gives you CDR on Frenzied Regen, your generators, cost reduction on your spenders, and then additional haste as well. It also gets a nice chunk of CDR from the Ursoc's Guidance talent, reducing this baseline 3-minute CD to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 minutes, depending on your talents and the target count. Your most frequently used defensive is going to be Barkskin. This is a solid 20% DR on a very short 32-second cooldown. You also have Rage of the Sleeper, which interacts with that 10.2 tier bonus, giving a 25% DR as well as some damage and leech on a 1-minute cooldown. Finish off your trio of defensive CDs. Bears also have Survival Instincts, a short 50% DR with a just over 2-minute cooldown. Something else potentially to consider for certain bosses or tank busters is the 15% DR provided by Tooth and Claw, assuming this actually overlaps with the ability cast you're worried about, and note that when you raise with Tooth and Claw, it applies this DR to all targets hit. For self-healing tools, bears of course have Frenzied Regen. If talented into it, you also get some pretty big heals from Dream of Cenarius regrowth procs. Notably, this can also actually be cast on any player, not just yourself, so you can do a little bit of off-healing here if you're not in danger. Ursoc's Fury is your more passive healing option as well when you're talented into it, and this just gives you an absorb shield capped at 30% of your HP based on the damage of your Mauls, Raises, and Thrashes. So, how these work together. I think I'm going to focus on Mythic Plus here because raid bosses tend to be more scripted and more individual timings to each raid boss, whereas Mythic Plus is a bit more general here. First things first, Incarn, your most powerful and most important TD. This is going to make pulls that otherwise aren't possible, something you can actually safely do, as it allows you to easily hit the armor cap with Iron Fur thanks to that cost reduction, allows you to kind of spam out things like Thrash and Raise for bigger Ursoc's Fury shields, and if needed, you can also spam heal yourself with Frenzied Regens as it has no cooldown during Incarnation. Because this CD is so long, right, it's 30 seconds, you'll likely want to make sure you only press this button when the pack that you're fighting is actually going to live for the whole or the vast majority of the duration. It definitely feels bad to pop Incarn like halfway through a pack and then it dies in 10 to 15 seconds and you're just sitting there wasting half or more of the duration of your Incarn. So keep that in mind. Also, very often you'll see people overlap Barkskin with the Incarnation cast at some point, usually at the start if you have it available, but you know, if you don't, nothing out of the world kind of any point throughout it, because again, 30-second duration Incarn, 32-second CD Barkskin, you want to try and get as many Barkskin uses as you possibly can, just, you know, for defensive value and that kind of thing, and so, you know, you're going to be wasting casts if you don't use it during that Incarnation duration for the most part. This kind of ties into another massive mistake that I see newer Guardians make, and that's just not pressing their defensive abilities or abilities like Incarn, like Barkskin, and especially with the new tier, Rage of the Sleeper is going to be a big one, right? Having these abilities just kind of sit off cooldown doesn't really do you any good. You'll be losing out on both offensive and defensive output by doing so, so make sure you are using these. In the case of Barkskin and Rage of the Sleeper, you usually want to make sure you don't overlap these like we were just talking about with Barkskin and Incarn, or even Rage of the Sleeper and Incarn, just because the DRs don't stack additively, they stack multiplicatively, so you start to lose value when you put these two cooldowns specifically together. So usually you'll see people chain them back to back. And again, don't forget, you really want to make sure you are pooling Rage before you cast Rage of the Sleeper because of the new tier set. Get up to at least 80 Rage, otherwise you're going to be losing a ton of value from our new tier. In general, your Barkskin and Rage of the Sleeper usage are going to be much more loose and free since they are short cooldowns. But again, that means they're easy to forget. So make sure you remember to use these. If we're talking about getting established at the start of pulls, it can be quite hard to do sometimes. And so I recommend making sure you have either Barkskin or Incarnation, or even both, available for initially on pull. This helps you get aggro on the pull. This helps you survive the initial kind of scary getting into a pack kind of thing. Pooling Rage at the end of a previous trash pack that you're no longer scared of when it's starting to die can also be quite useful, as it lets you kind of walk in, put an Iron Fur up, maybe raise right off the top to get aggro, that kind of thing. Very, very useful. Aside from these active effects that I've talked about, there are some more passive DRs I mentioned, right? Tooth and Claw, Ursoc's Fury and the Absorb Shield, and there's also Rend and Tear from the Talent Tree, which is 2% DR per Thrash stack, and these are kind of your universal line of defense here. They work against all forms of damage, magic, physical, bleeds. You don't really need to think about them for the most part. As long as you are doing your rotation correctly, you're going to be maximizing both the offensive and defensive portion of these talents. Finally, we've got the bread and butter of Guardian Druids, Iron Fur. A good general rule for this spender is to try and maintain at least one stack as long as you are actively taking physical damage. During Incarn, this gets a hefty cost reduction, so it's quite easy to maintain more than one stack. Just be aware that anything above 6-ish stacks, maybe less with an augmentation evoker buffing you, is actually armor cap, so you don't actually get any real benefit above this point outside of just getting to dump your rage without using your main GCD. Since this is also a spender, it does of course compete with Maul and Raze, which do have real defensive gains because of that Ursoc's Fury shielding. So in general, that's kind of why you want to prioritize using Maul and Raze instead of Iron Fur, because it also has that massive damage increase over an Iron Fur usage. So again, hanging out 1 to 2 Iron Fur stacks, spending the rest of your rage on either Maul or Raze, depending on the situation, lets you kind of have that diversity too in having that armor up, but also having that Absorb Shield from Ursoc's Fury, which helps against all damage types. From there, let's talk about gearing stuff, where to start, we kind of need to cover stats. So, as I've mentioned many times before, for Guardian Druids, and honestly a lot of other tank specs as well, the best stat is always, always, always item level. The reason for this is that the gains in agility, armor, and stamina largely outweigh any difference in secondary stat gains, with the exception of pieces like jewelry or trinkets, which lack both agility and armor for jewelry, or just have other unique effects in trinkets. So something to keep in mind there. In general, if you're feeling less tanky than like some streamer or YouTuber, whatever looks, the difference is probably not your stat priority. It's going to be in your rotational and your defensive play, which I just covered. So focus on improving those things as opposed to completely changing up what stats you're going for. With that said, let's talk about what each stat actually does for Guardian Druids. Armor and stamina, relatively straightforward here, not going to go into them. Agility, a bit less so. So basically, this will increase all the power of your attack power scaling abilities, which is pretty much everything you have, right? It gives you some dodge rating on top of that, and also increases the amount of armor an individual stack of Iron Fur gives. Overall, this is a lot you're gaining from just one single stat, so you can kind of see why this is Guardian's best by a lot. From there, we've got Haste. This reduces your global cooldown, as well as the general cooldown of Mangle, Thrash, and Frenzied Regeneration, which in my opinion makes the spec just feel a lot better when you have a decent amount of it. Mastery is basically just a passive increase to your health pool, healing received, and attack power. It definitely is a bit more defensive in value compared to offensive, especially when you're looking at some of the other stats down the line here. Versatility, very straightforward passive boost to your damage, healing, and some damage reduction as well. Notably, this also increases external damage sources like trinket effects, so potentially good if you're using flat damage trinkets, and it also has an effect on the strength of absorb shields like Urslok's Fury, as well as the 10.2 tier bonus. Finally, crit gives you some additional dodge rating for defensive value, and like versatility, also impacts those external damage sources from things like trinkets, and this can be a nice damage boost depending on the setup you're running. If you're comparing gear of a similar item level, my recommendation, always sim yourself to see what's best, but if you just kind of want a general priority system, I'll give you that too. I'd go with haste, followed by versatility, then crit, and finally mastery. Again, emphasizing here, this is for comparing gear of the same item level, since otherwise, higher item level pieces, regardless of stats, are usually better. With stats covered, let's talk about gear itself. Starting off easy with embellishments, 10.2 saw nerfs to pretty much all flat damage embellishments in the game, as well as Spore Cloak. Despite this, wearing Toxic Thorn boots with a toxic patch on your bracers specifically remains the best option for Guardian Druids. Remember, make sure you upgrade the boots first, as the proc does scale with item level. Talking about weapons, there's another heavy hitter to discuss this tier, and that is Roshan, the Immortal Blaze, which drops from the final boss of the raid, Farak. Now, currently, this is looking to be by far the best weapon available for Guardian Druids this patch, where even the heroic version of this weapon is better than anything else available, but if you're not much of a raider, you're not going to get this. What you can hunt for is Borrowed Time, and that is in the Murazon's Rise dungeon, and this just has some extra time strike, which is just a bit of extra damage on it. Moving on, trinkets. Everyone's favorite. There's of course a ton to choose from. I have a full list with my thoughts on each in the method guide, but in this video I'm going to focus only on my top picks here just to save some time. If you're a raider looking for your best options, Cataclysmic Signet brand from Smolderon is looking very good. It kind of resembles Anvil a little bit from Aberrus. There's a flat amount of damage that kind of stacks up over time, making it very strong on longer duration fights. But notably, this does deal a not insignificant amount of damage back to yourself as well when above 5 stacks, so keep that in mind. Alongside that, the two very rare trinkets from Farak are also looking very powerful for tanks. The more offensive one is Augury of the Primal Flame, and then there's the more defensive one in Farak's Tainted Rage Heart, where the former here just kind of passive damage. The latter deals some lower passive damage, but then has the on-use effect that deals most of the damage, and then has some absorb tied to it as well, so it's got a bit more defensive aspect. Another good damage option in Raid actually comes from Darkheart Thicket in Oakheart's Gnarled Root. This is a caster trinket, so keep that in mind. Guardians can actually get around this requirement that requires you to cast spells, because Moonfire counts as a spell. So because of this, and you're running Galactic Guardian, you're going to be using Moonfire a fair bit. This actually contributes quite a bit of damage in a raid environment. You will need to make sure you're in balanced loot spec to actually get the trinket in the first place, but the damage output that this trinket provides is definitely worth it. Finally, the Prophetic Stone Scales from Galakrond's Fall. Super powerful defensive option whenever you need to cheat death, though again, this is not going to be good all the time. It's only going to be good in content where tanks are in extreme danger, and so maybe there is a boss this tier where that is the case. Maybe you're under geared, whatever it is, but if you're over geared for content, or if the boss is not dangerous to tanks, you're probably not going to run this trinket. Looking to Mythic Plus, I think again we have to mention one of the very rare Farak trinkets, Tainted Rage Heart, is definitely going to overcome that other one, Augury, in keys, because that passive damage it does kind of scales infinitely into AoE, right? So the more AoE you're doing, you're going to get more value from the damage passive portion of that trinket. Plus, again, it's a nice little defensive boost when you use that on-use, which is always nice. Again, on-use versus proc trinkets, you're always going to prefer on-use as a tank. The Cheat Death trinket is also going to be widely used if you're looking to push higher and higher keys, where mobs kind of become significantly more dangerous. But again, in your weekly keys, probably not something that's going to be worth running. Outside of the options we've already mentioned in the previous section, Gift of the Ursine Vengeance from Council of Dreams is also extremely powerful in keys. It gives you a ton of agility, which, as we already discussed, is by far the best stat for Guardian Druids. And on top of that, the counterattack effect that it has scales extremely well with target count, making this significantly better in dungeons than in Raid. Next, let's quickly cover things like Enchants, Gems, and kind of other consumable recommendations here. Reminder again, full write-up of these things is over on the Method site, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but on screen, right, we've got the Waking stats on your chest, Leech on your bracers and cloak. your choice here between a little bit of stamina on your boots or some speed. We've got haste on your rings, and then if you're looking for damage in like a pure single target scenario, Shadow Flame Wreath is the option. But if you're looking at above that, or for more just general defensive option, it's going to be Sophic Devotion, so that's going to be my general recommendation to use there. Of course, you've got the Leg Enchant and Fierce Armor Kit, the Neck Enchant into your Medallion settings. If you're looking at your gems, I'm going to recommend the Haste main gem, so Fierce Limited Diamond, and then Energized Yzmerald, which gives you a little bit of verse on top of that haste. For files, it's going to kind of depend on the situation. Most commonly, it's going to be Eye in the Storm versus Tepid Versatility. For Eye in the Storm, this is very, very good because it gives you a ton of agility for tanking mobs. So in Mythic Plus on Fortified weeks, this is a very, very strong option. Otherwise, Tepid Versatility for Raid and then Tyrannical weeks is also quite strong. But generally, if you can get the value from Eye in the Storm, it's going to be better. If you can't, Tepid Versatility is going to be better. If you're trying to do some big damage, the File of Corrupting Rage is very, very powerful, but usually it's going to be between Eye in the Storm and Tepid Versatility. Then, of course, you've got your damage pots and the ultimate power potions. In AoE, Shocking Disclosure is going to be very, very good, so keep that in mind. And then you've got your new healing potion, the Dreamwalker's Healing Potion. And for your weapon enchant, you're going to be wanting to run the Howling Rune. One last thing I wanted to briefly talk about are some useful macros and weak auras for Guardian Druids. Again, full list here is going to be at the end of that method written guide, so check that out for specifics. The biggest one for sure, I think it's most useful, is when you're running the Dream of Cenarius talent. You have a macro that basically forces you to stay in bear form, so if you don't have a Dream of Cenarius proc, and you accidentally fat finger or press that regrowth button, you are all of a sudden in human form getting hit in the face by mobs. So really, really useful macro there. On top of that, I've got plenty of mouse over macros, got focus kick macros, you've got a weak aura pack for your UI, which is actually made by my Kotang Krill. Shout out him. I've also got more basic kind of Iron Fur or After the Wildfire trackers if you don't want a full UI. Also link Krill's Wildgo profile down in the description, and again, specific links and macros are over in the method guide. But that is the end of this video, guys. Hopefully this helps to level up your Guardian Druid game in patch 10.2, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those down in the comments below, or come ask me over on my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I'll be streaming all of my Mythic Plus keys and raid progression to start the season from a tank's perspective. Of course, I need to give a massive shout out to all of my subscribers over on Patreon. I really, really do appreciate the support. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.